Hello and welcome everyone to English 122. This is a course on keywords in theory, and for this quarter, for the next 10 weeks, we will be studying the complex and rather interesting term culture. The term is complex because, in the way that we use it today, it may mean several very different things. It's a slippery term, as well as a politically and ideologically loaded one in some discursive contexts, and in others it's more neutral. This is because, as you'll soon see in the upcoming lecture, that the word itself has deep linguistic roots in several European languages that developed its meanings over many centuries. Over time, and amongst certain societies, it has meant very specific kinds of things. But because language, as we all know, is constantly evolving to fit the many historical ruptures and social transformations and human migrations and endless adaptations that are a general part of human life, the word culture has become almost too meaningful, too full of associations, and too general in its application. Having said that, the word is called a keyword in theory, and literary theory in particular, because scholars and literary critics and students such as yourselves across many different academic disciplines cannot do without it to discuss almost all aspects and issues that come up within the study of the humanities and in the social sciences. So the way to begin a course like this one is to be very practical at the outset. By which I mean we'll start today by tracing the historical origins of the term to see where it came from, what it has meant at different periods, what it can mean to us now, and why the word is so saturated with residual, archaic, and emerging connotations that advanced students like yourselves would benefit from knowing something about. I'm going to explain more about what this class is about, what will be required of you, what the readings and the goals of the course are, but first things first. When we meet online for the first time, we'll start off with some basic introductions so that we can get to know each other a little better for our class over the next 10 weeks. But for now, I'd like to introduce you to myself and give you a brief account of my professional interests and some other information. Now, my name, as you probably know, since it's on the previous slide, is Joseph Dimuro. I began teaching here in the English department at UCLA in the year 2001, and before that I was a lecturer in the English department at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia for 5 years, and before that I taught in the English department at the University of Chicago, where I completed a master's degree and then a PhD degree in English language and literature. I grew up outside of Boston, and I am married to another academic. We live in Hollywood, which always cracks up my friends when I tell them that. And we have a little elderly dachshund named Clover, who may insist on being heard occasionally at the most inopportune moments during our class time, but at least you'll know her name if you hear her in the background. My academic specialization includes several different but related fields, including American literature and culture, with an emphasis on late 19th century writing, the English and American novel from the Victorian period to the modernist era, literary theory and queer studies, as well as the history and theory of the novel. When I'm not teaching, I'm usually researching and writing. I've published 2 scholarly editions of literary works by the late 19th century, early 20th century Chicago novelist Henry Blake Fuller, essays on the American literary canon, the work of the American authors Willa Cather, Henry James, Edith Wharton, and other realist writers. And I'm currently working on a book I've been writing for a while now about the meaning of the original Ferris wheel that was built for the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893. Now here at UCLA, I've worn a number of different administrative hats as well over the years. I've been the director of the English Departmental Honors Program for 10 of those years. I founded an undergraduate conference for English majors called ACES, as well as established the Beyond English series of guest speakers who are former UCLA English majors that we invite back to campus to speak to our current students about how their training in the department has helped them in their job searches and in their career paths, many of which represent a wide variety of opportunities for students like yourselves. I serve as a member of the undergraduate committee of the English department and currently as the faculty undergraduate advisor. In that role, I assist and advise students about how to negotiate and plan their coursework for completing the major in English or the major in American Literature and Culture. In that capacity, I also help our majors find information about graduate school or professional programs they may be interested in after graduation or in exploring job and career opportunities once they leave us. So I'm happy to speak to any of you about these things, so please feel free to contact me. In the department, I teach or have taught a number of different courses over the years, including this one. I've regularly taught a course on the 19th century English novel, for example, a survey course on American literature from 1865 to 1900, a course on the fiction of the American 1920s, courses on the short story collection, an undergraduate seminar that I'm teaching this quarter on the theory of the novel, and a single author course on the Anglo-American writer Henry James, whom you will come to know something about when we read a short story by him called Brooksmith. The best way to reach me, incidentally, is by email, which is also the main way I'll be in contact with you. And this means to be sure to check your email, at least once a day. And if you have not already done so, please go to the CCLE course website for English 122 to make sure that you know your way around that platform, those various menus and functions. And I'll say more about how to use that site in just a moment. But right now I want to let you know that my regular office hours for this quarter will be on Thursday afternoons from 12 noon to 2 p.m., beginning in the first week of the quarter. And of course, these are via Zoom, and they don't require a formal appointment. So feel free to just stop by with any questions you might have, or if you need some help or other matters pertaining to the class. If that's not the best time of the week, incidentally, for you to meet with me, please contact me to schedule an appointment for a different time, and I will try to accommodate that. So let me say a few words now about how the course will work and what it's about. English 122 is one of the required theory courses in English and American literature and culture that majors need to complete their degrees. I thought it might be useful to reiterate and clarify what's meant by that word theory right from the beginning, before attempting to explain how and why the concept of culture makes sense in this context. The contemporary word theory comes from a late Latin term derived from the Greek theoria, meaning contemplation or speculation. Theoria comes from the Greek theoros, meaning spectator. Theories are based on general principles that are sometimes independent of the thing that they are attempting to explain, which is what makes the study of theory often somewhat abstract and general. Usually when we talk about theory, we're talking about a theory of something or about something in particular, not really a key word in theory. This class, for example, is not so much about a theory of culture as it is about how the concept of culture itself may be used quite powerfully to unlock many areas of inquiry and some new perspectives into the meaning and interpretation of literary works. As you've made your way through the academic study of literature, You've no doubt developed important skills in reading and writing. You certainly know, for instance, that literary works use language in a way that is quite different from the language we use in other areas of communication, such as our daily transactions with other people. Literary language is also framed differently. That is, it communicates information in a different kind of way that heightens or calls attention to the language itself as an aesthetic medium. If a text is classified as a novel, a short story, a poem, or play that appears in a certain format, like a literary magazine, a published book, a volume of poetry, all of that framing or packaging contributes to our expectations about what we are reading. If you did an experiment, for instance, and collected all of the tweets, text messages, or Instagram messages you had sent and received over the past month and then published them together as a book, you would have some idea of what I'm talking about when I say how persuasive this packaging may be in conveying the idea that a literary text has been produced. But of course, this would only take you so far, and you would still not really have produced anything like a novel. That's because you would need a lot more than that. For example, certain other kinds of expectations have to be met. Readers expecting a novel or a narrative poem or a play would be looking for visible markers of a different kind of language use. They might look, for instance, for repeated patterns of images or themes, or a character that is developing over time, or a plot, a sense of rhythm and coherence, and many other conventions. Those things we are used to seeing in literary works are sometimes basic and intuitive, as if we were born with them. Others are more nuanced, more sophisticated, and take training and years of reading to become habitual to us, to become pleasurable even. In most of your English classes, a part of what you are learning and practicing as an expert reader and commentator of literary works has to do with understanding the basic differences between various kinds of literary works. In fact, that is how the academic discipline of English studies is arranged in the university curriculum. We differentiate prose fiction from poetry, plays from film scripts, digital texts from graphic novels, haikus from sonnets, short stories from novels, and each of these influence how language is used and what conventions we look for. What's even more interesting is the way certain works draw upon and disrupt generic categories. They challenge conventions, and they establish fresh artistic responses to the changing circumstances of life. All of this is to say that literature is a discourse among other discourses. Any specialized use of language, from legal terminology, scientific publications, theology, and all of the academic disciplines you can think of are called discourses. Some are more highly specialized than others and require years of training and practice to be able to speak and write fluidly within the fields of knowledge that they represent. This consolidation into discourse is how knowledge is organized and disseminated. There are consequences to this. Not everyone has access to the kind of knowledge expressed in specialized discourses. Also, given the disciplinary boundaries and divisions that you can see organizing our own university, these fields of knowledge do not often speak to each other in any kind of common way. As professionalism accelerated throughout the 19th century, along with advances in technology and science, the expansion of the capitalist economy and many other modern developments, these divisions have grown more rigid. This is why many academics in the field of the humanities stretch their imaginations, research, teaching, and methodologies into what is called interdisciplinarity. In a sense, when we study a concept like culture, we are by default crossing these disciplinary boundaries by looking at literary texts alongside other kinds of writing, such as philosophy, social criticism, anthropology, economics, historical materialism, and other non-literary discourses. Keeping this idea of discourse in mind as we go forward is very helpful in a number of ways, the first of which is to break open a certain kind of familiar approach you may have been taught with regard to reading and writing about literature. I shouldn't limit this just to you, because even I was mostly trained this way in high school and in college, as well as the 3 generations of humanists who preceded us. What I'm talking about is a method called formalism, or what we've come to know as close reading. In many of your English classes, this will be a very familiar term to you and a very familiar practice. Formalism is a method of reading and writing about a literary text that involves analyzing and explicating the ways in which a literary text assembles and uses language, how it shapes language into a coherent, aesthetically accomplished artifact made of words. It's a method built on the assumption that the form a text assumes is an essential part of what it means, and it is inseparable from the kinds of messages and ideas that it conveys to the reader. In biology, we call this method by the analogous term morphology. When biologists study plants and animals, for example, they learn to recognize and classify organisms by their external and internal shapes, as well as by their distinctive features. This point is not merely to take stock of, the point of that is not merely just to take stock of the genus and species of everything in the living world, but to understand the absolute rightness of the form that fits its unique organic function in the world. Likewise, a typical exercise in the practice of close reading attempts to do something quite similar with the literary text. We look for how the parts of a work contribute to the whole of it, and how the whole of that work is contained within each of its component parts. On a micro level, we may look, for example, at the length and syntactic complexity of sentences to determine the author's style, or examine the use of punctuation, the connotations of words the author selects, the repeated images that are used, or the metaphors and allusions that amplify certain themes in the work. Our resulting interpretations, or readings, are meant to demonstrate the coherence and artistic logic of our findings, and we weave our understanding of the form into what our understanding of what the text means, and maybe even how it relates to the greater world and to experience. Clearly, we also do much more than this with a literary text. We may read ideological influences into a text, grasp historical transformations that only literary works can convey on an intimate, widely applicable level, consider race and gender relations, or examine issues of social justice and so forth. These are important advances in the study of literature, but even interpretations like these depend on some level of argumentative convention and an art of persuasion through the presentation of evidence from the text itself. We use close reading to arrive at the conclusions that we hope will enlighten our readers about the work in question, or teach them something about it and bring them to a deeper understanding of the text that they are reading. I've been talking about the concept of discourse because I think literature is one of those places where the borders and divisions of knowledge break down and are reformulated in ways that refresh our habitual modes of perception and understanding. Literary texts are like opportunistic sponges with regard to the language and discursive formations that surround them, they give rise to, etc., and that determine their reception in the real world and in the future. How could they not? Writers, like all of us, are embedded in a world of discourses, and they can only build their work out of the tools available to them in their particular historical and cultural moment. At this point, then, I would like you all to reimagine the practice of close reading as having a goal somewhat more ambitious than a good interpretation of the aesthetic coherence of the text, as if it were just an artifact made in a vacuum. Let's think instead about identifying strands of discourse in the literary text itself that have been appropriated by the writer and reoriented into something else. How, for example, does the author Edith Wharton draw upon her reading of early 20th century anthropology in her novel The Age of Innocence? And why does she do this? How does the vocabulary we find sprinkled throughout that text, having to do with things like tribes, rituals, ceremonies, and sacrifices, make sense in her story of an engaged couple in 1870s New York? Likewise, why do we find the butler in Henry James's short story Brooksmith aspiring to learn what his betters know in a way that uses language that seems to come right out of Matthew Arnold? These are just a few instances of the kinds of questions we'll be addressing in this class. When we use this method of reading and analysis that I've just described, we're talking about a genealogical process, which in current theoretical terms means the tracing of the development and changes that occur among and between the various discourses that circulate through the culture at any given time. I'll say one more important thing about the relationship between discourses and the disciplinary fields of knowledge that they consolidate and institutionalize, which is mainly the connection between knowledge and what the influential French historian Michel Foucault calls power. What he means by that is how the discourse of any given field of knowledge determines what that knowledge can be. That is, what kinds of questions can be asked and answered about a subject, what can be thought about that subject, and what limits are imposed upon inquiry by the very nature of the language used to talk about it. The readings that I've selected for us this quarter are arranged according to a few broad categories that cover some of the major aspects of the concept of culture. They extend from roughly the middle of the 19th century up to the present time. The English poet and social critic Matthew Arnold was probably the first important thinker to bring the word culture into political discourse with a book called Culture and Anarchy in the late 1860s. Arnold uses the term to denote a certain kind of critical thinking about the world, as well as a particular body of knowledge, largely represented by the great works of art and literature from the ancient Greek and Roman world, as well as the religious tradition of Hebraism. Arnold, as we'll see, believed our highest purpose as human beings in society was to cultivate a love of perfection, to learn the best that has been thought and known in the world, and then to perpetuate that as broadly as possible. Those are his words. Today, this idea of culture, which I must say is more complicated in Arnold's work, as you will see, than it sounds here, is politically and ideologically suspect, as it should be, reflecting as it does certain class privileges and restricting the, quote, best that has been thought and known, unquote, to the history of Europe, primarily. But it is Arnold who made the word culture as volatile and compelling as it remains today, especially when we think about what are called the culture wars that erupted in the United States in the 1980s and appear to have resurfaced in our own day. We'll track the immediate influence of Arnold's work on writers like Henry James and the modernist poet T.S. Eliot. And then we'll explore some of the critiques and misgivings that certain creative writers had about this idea of culture, especially in Willa Cather's famous short story, Paul's Case, where culture and social class come into tragic conflict. From here, we go a little backward in time to get a sense of where Arnold's ideas were coming from. And that will take us to the hugely influential philosophy of Immanuel Kant. Kant understood the appreciation of beauty as an abstract, disinterested capacity of the mind that had little or nothing to do with sensation or emotions, not to mention anything else having to do with the material world of commerce and consumption. We will see these fundamental ideas of Kant challenged in compelling ways by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels when we read the foundational text of historical materialism called The German Ideology, and then we'll track the influence of that work upon the Marxist critic Raymond Williams, as well as the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, and these all remain absolutely central figures in any pursuit of literary theory and cultural studies. We will then read one of the most original and interesting books written by an American about social class and culture at the turn of the 20th century, Thorstein Veblen's The Theory of the Leisure Class, to describe what he means by the very famous phrase, conspicuous consumption. It would be a central part of our study of culture. Conspicuous consumption, incidentally, means the status conscious establishment of material goods that people surround themselves with in order to enhance their prestige and status in society. You'll probably begin to see many similarities between Veblen's work and Pierre Bourdieu's, which will bring us to the end of that particular stream of thinking about the ideas of culture before we turn to an entirely different way of thinking about that word. The different one I have in mind is shaped by the academic discipline of cultural anthropology and its related field of ethnography. The best of this kind of work, and the one most closely related to the principles of textual interpretation that are most familiar to literary critics, is the work of Clifford Geertz, whose essays are lucidly written and interesting examinations of everything from Balinese cockfighting rituals to Javanese symbols of esteem and ceremonies of social status. It is at that point that we'll be well versed in the idea of culture and ready to take on one of the best novels of Edith Wharton called The Age of Innocence, which is, among other things, an extended meditation on the dying out of a certain kind of rigidified culture and its values over a period of 2 decades. Written in 1920, it is a novel that observes the details of a particular, extremely wealthy and cultivated group of New Yorkers in the years immediately following the Civil War up to the 1890s. As we near the end of the course, we'll look at the 1920s from a different angle, that of the beginnings of a new kind of Marxist-inspired cultural criticism that came out of the institutions of higher learning in Frankfurt, Germany, in the later part of that decade. And here we'll encounter the work of one of the Frankfurt School's most original thinkers, Walter Benjamin, and read his famous essay on the work of art in the age of its mechanical reproducibility, alongside the later work of Bourdieu and then Theodor Adorno's book on the so-called culture industry. Finally, with all of this under our belts, we come full circle with another novel written by Willa Cather in 1925 called The Professor's House, in which you will see many of the themes and complications that we've been examining around the meaning of culture and civilization. At the outset, I want to be clear about how much time, work, and effort you'll need to complete this course to your satisfaction, and for you to get the most out of it. I am, of course, aware that this is probably not the only course that you're taking this quarter, and that the majority of you have additional responsibilities as well in the form of jobs, families, and other crucial activities going on in your lives. I'm also very aware of how the current pandemic and natural disasters in California and general unrest are impacting our normal routines, our health, and our commitments in unprecedented ways. These conditions, as you well know, may change for the better or for the worse at a moment's notice, or they may stay as they are for quite a long time. So we will adapt and do the best we can as we go along. I must say that I feel personally disappointed that I will not be in the classroom with you, which is my natural habitat, as it were, as it is probably yours and what you're more used to, obviously. The direct interaction, spontaneity, the energy of a live class cannot easily be replaced by remote learning. Even more heartbreaking is this profound sense of disappointment you must be feeling about this very strange sort of isolating interruption of your college career, and the general feeling of uncertainty about the future. But learning never really stops, and curiosity never really withers. And the human spirit is made to overcome obstacles like the ones we're facing, no matter how daunting they might seem to us at the time. So with that hope, I think we can get along very well in ways that approximate what it would be like to be in an actual classroom. At least I will try to be doing that from my end, and I hope that you'll be doing it from yours. Let me just say, however, that this difficult time in your lives can also be surprisingly productive, creative, and even joyful, a way of spending some time for greater reflection. And you're being tested in ways that previous generations were also tested. And it's just that we've taken so much for granted for so long that, let me assure you, we will get through this, and we will be better people for having done so. Having said that, in planning the syllabus and designing the course, I've carefully calculated the amount of time and work you should put into the class by using the university's own guidelines. The class, for example, carries 5 academic units, which means that for each one of those units, 3 hours of instruction, reading, writing, or other kinds of participation are required per week to meet the educational goals of this course. 3 hours of that total are, of course, dedicated to the weekly class meetings themselves, and the other 12 hours are to be spent viewing the hour-long lecture presentations, hour-long for the most part, completing the weekly readings, preparing notes and/or oral presentations for class. There won't be oral presentations for this class, and completing writing assignments of various lengths. With regard to reading time, I estimate that it takes about 1 hour to read between 20 and 30 pages of text carefully. At least that's what it takes me, and I'm a pretty slow reader. Some of you may require less or more time than that, which I understand. But in general, I think if you can manage to read between 20 and 30 pages of material per day, you'll be more than likely to be able to complete the reading in time for each class meeting. Now, some of the readings are quite dense, and some are not. So that certainly has to be factored into your time management. I should also say that even though the literary texts on our schedule may seem easier to read, maybe more fun, etc., they ought to be approached with the same care and analytical scrutiny that you'd use in studying the theoretical materials. The theoretical readings are in some cases challenging because they include ideas that might be quite new to you. Some of these ideas and arguments involve us knowing something about the references they make to other works of literature, literary movements, historical events, philosophers, and the specific names of writers that you might not be familiar with. You may need to look up some of these names and some of the words being used as you read, or ask about them in class. For the most part, though, you should be perfectly able to locate and grasp and be able to summarize for yourself in your own words the main claims that are being made in the various essays and books that you're reading. So have patience and treat the experience like the intellectual adventure that it is truly meant to be. The key to a good education, after all, is to maintain an active curiosity about new ways of thinking and new kinds of information that come your way. Before the class officially begins, please make sure to get all of the texts that you'll need and put them in order. The first thing to do is to download and print out hard copies of all of the PDF documents that are required for the course so that you'll have them ready for each class. There are a total of 14 documents, and they have all been uploaded already to the CCLE website, where you will also find a copy of the course syllabus, links to the required video presentations, as well as writing assignments and other useful information. Please note that not all of the video presentation links are up yet for the entire class, nor the writing assignments, but they will be in plenty of time for you to find them and watch them. I'll always also send a reminder once they are posted. In a column on the left side of the CCL site page, you'll find the weekly schedule of readings, viewings, and assignments. Click on each of the weekly links to find the readings that you need to download at the bottom of the page under the schedule. The video links may also be found there. The other texts you will need include 8 paperback books, which you will see listed on the first page of the course syllabus. Please get the editions that I ordered for the course using the correct ISBN numbers when you purchase them online. I want to reiterate how important it is to come prepared to the live Zoom meetings with these materials. This is a lecture class that normally meets on Mondays and Wednesdays from 2 to 3:50 p.m. For the first week of the class, we will have a live Zoom meeting on Monday and on Wednesday at those times, but thereafter the only live Zoom meetings will be on Wednesdays from 2 p.m. to 3:50 p.m. This is the only synchronous part of the schedule, and I ask you to check in on time. Be sure to have a reliable wireless connection, and if you can, please find a relatively quiet, well-lit place for you to participate in the meeting for the full time without any major interruptions. I would prefer to see you on video, although you don't. You can opt out of that if you want, although I don't really like it. And I urge you to, in the Zoom meetings, ask questions, respond to comments that are made, or discuss the readings in ways that you find helpful for us to discuss. Remember, this is your time to think out loud and with others and to make the most of the materials that you're reading. Be curious, be courageous, and don't take center stage for too long. Be courteous and respectful of other people's time and thoughts because they do have them. Believe me, they do. If for some outstanding reason you cannot attend one of these meetings, let me know. I will record the live Zoom sessions and post them later on the course website if people need to review them. The other part of the course is asynchronous, which should give you a little more flexibility in your daily schedule. Each week, for instance, in addition to completing the readings, please view the pre-recorded lecture presentations like this one before joining the live meetings on Wednesday afternoons. You'll find more specific information about grades, assignments, and method of evaluation on the syllabus, but I would like to stress here the importance of full attendance and active engagement with the materials you'll be reading over the next 10 weeks. Now, if after reviewing the syllabus and this introductory presentation, you honestly feel that you cannot complete the course in the way that you would like to, please consider taking a different one. At this point, I'll say a few things about the origins of the word culture, and then we'll look at, perhaps in another presentation to come right after this one, the poems that I gave you from Matthew Arnold and William Butler Yeats. When I started teaching this course several years ago, I would ask students on the very first day to write 5 sentences using the word culture in them, even before saying anything about the subject. As you can imagine, there was a wide and interesting range of uses that came immediately to students' minds. Most of us use the word culture to name a thing, or a concept, or abstraction, which is a kind of thing after all, rather than using it to describe something that happens, or something that conveys an action, or that alters something, as in a process. We can tell this by the part of speech the word plays in the sentence. In English, as you know, the part of speech designating a thing, a person, a place, an idea, is called a noun. Words like the imagination or politics. In other words, simply defined, a noun in English is any word you can put the article the in front of, or a descriptive word in front of. The academic culture of UCLA, for instance, or political culture of the early 21st century. The parts of speech designating actions in combination with temporality of the time when the action happens, is happening, or has already happened, is called a verb. If you change the time in a sentence, the word you always have to change to convey that is the verb. Let's take an example of using culture as a noun, putting aside for now any consideration of meanings. The culture of different people reflects in their music, dress, and food. His large library demonstrates that he has a lot of culture. In this next slide are some slight variations in the kind of noun that's being used, as a modifying adjective, for instance, in the bottom 3 sentences. I respect the cultural backgrounds of others. Cultural change is often due to many different factors. The Aztec culture incorporated human sacrifice. And in the top 3 examples on this slide, the noun can be modified by an adjective. American culture is often thought to be rather strange by most foreigners. Younger generations are ruled by pop culture. In Latinx culture, it is common that Dia de los Muertos is celebrated. In this slide, there are 3 examples where you begin to see some residue of an action or of a completed or ongoing process, as if in these sentences something has happened, or there is the implication that culture is something that can happen. The word in these cases, though, is still not being used as a verb. It is best to be cultured. She is cultured because she enjoys important art. One becomes cultured through education and discipline. Finally, we have 2 examples that use the word in an entirely different sense, that is, as an organic substance. This sense derives from a very old meaning of the term culture, which we still use in the word agriculture or animal husbandry. In general, it's a term for tending of crops or cultivating the soil. Since these kinds of activities denote human actions that work upon nature, there is a deep dialectical meaning of the modern word culture that juxtaposes or contrasts it with the word nature. In other words, culture is that which is done to nature, and is therefore not the same as nature, and vice versa. When I use that term dialectical, I simply mean a term that cannot be defined independent of another term, usually its opposite. As you remember from your first reading of Raymond Williams, the most difficult and complex word to define in English besides culture is the word nature. Before moving on, let's look at another important aspect of culture, which is the kinds of evaluative judgments that attach to the use of the word. For instance, when I say it is best to be cultured, or she is cultured because she understands and enjoys important art, I sound as if I'm praising someone for having this virtue. When I say one only becomes cultured through higher education and personal discipline, I'm starting to sound a little judgmental about people who are not educated. If you think about what these statements imply, you have to conclude that in the first case, it's not good to not be cultured. On the other hand, can you think of a negative aspect of being cultured in this way? things like being pretentious or snobbish or a classist or being somewhat unnatural. In the second case that I gave you, the she in the sentence is said to be cultured not because she enjoys watching a show called Love Island on television, or that she hangs velvet paintings of big-eyed children on her walls, but because she enjoys important art. And in the last case that I gave you, no one apparently can become cultured without submitting to a reputable, and let's say very expensive, institution of higher learning. Culture used in this way suggests a refinement of pleasures that go beyond the sensational or the physical, the kind of pleasure that is cultivated out of discipline and restraint of the appetites and impulses. It's the kind of pleasure more highly evolved people demonstrate as a model of human perfectibility. What we're talking about here is sometimes called high culture, as opposed to mass or popular culture. Access to prestige is associated with acquiring high culture and having other sorts of capital. For instance, having enough financial capital to pay for education or training in music or in dance, or trips abroad to visit museums around the world, etc., etc. One of the writers we will be reading, Pierre Bourdieu, labels this acquisition of high culture and advanced education cultural capital. But to acquire cultural capital, one must not only invest financial capital, but have the right kinds of connections that he refers to as social capital, meaning basically family circumstances and networks of influence. You'll see more detailed descriptions of these categories when you read Bourdieu's essay on the forms of capital. But for now, I need to reiterate a distinction that he makes between the category of cultural capital and that of financial capital. Because plenty of wealthy people are not cultured in the way that we're talking about. That is to say, they haven't acquired the right kind of taste, it might seem in some cases, or they might not have deep knowledge about the arts, etc. Or even their refinement of manners may be lacking. While on the other hand, those who have relatively low financial capital may in fact have high cultural capital and have high cultural attainments and refinements of taste. The value-laden connotations of the word culture become more apparent when it's used for political and/or ideological purposes. The idea of respecting other people's cultures, for example, might be perceived by some people as one of the effects of being cultured oneself. Anti-abortionist activists use the rhetoric of pro-life in a way that depends upon the contrast with what is often referred to as a culture of death. So you can see the many ways in which this word culture or culture of this or culture of that may be used in different political circumstances to argue different political positions. The erosion of genuine values is also implied when we talk about living in a consumer culture, for instance, in which nearly everyone can acquire mass-produced knockoff brands or acquire material goods and services. These examples are meant simply to demonstrate what lies at the heart of the difficulty of looseness, broadness, and abstraction that we face in accurately defining the concept of culture. But that same flexibility in the word makes it so promiscuously adaptable and so powerfully suggestive, and it attests to the fact that it is an indispensable concept for investigating any number of crucial issues in understanding our own times. This is also precisely the reason why the meaning of the word culture needs to be sorted out more carefully. The most practical way to do this is to begin with tracing the word's etymological roots and its changing usages at different points in history. And just here, Raymond Williams provides a very helpful guide for us. In 1976, the Welsh-born British social historian Raymond Williams published a landmark work entitled Culture and Society, 1780 to 1950, in which he sets out to describe the wider social and ideological effects of a dominant set of terms used throughout this period of English literature. In that same year, he published another book called Keywords, a vocabulary of culture and society, that was originally meant as an appendix to the other book. Keywords has in fact become a way of cataloging and defining major terms in other fields of inquiry to this day. For instance, there are books called Keywords in American Studies, Keywords in Literary Theory, and so on. Williams' Keywords includes 155 terms that compose what we call the sociological study of language and literature, demonstrating how words that are central to understanding our society take on new meanings, and how those meanings and changes reflect the political bent and values of society. Later, he revised the book to reflect the subtle changes that were occurring in the English language by adding another 21 terms. Some of these terms include class, hegemony, generation, ideology, criticism, status, industry, and of course the one we're now studying, culture. So let's take a look at that one. The forerunner of the English word comes from the Latin cultura, which derives from the verb colere. The verb colere had a wide range of meanings that include inhabit, cultivate, protect, and honor with worship. Some of these meanings eventually separated, although they still occasionally overlapped in the nouns derived from them. For example, the word inhabit developed through colonists to the noun colony, which still resonates in our contemporary English word colonialism. The branch of meaning that signifies honor with worship developed from cultus, from which we get our English word cult. In a book called The Idea of Culture, written by one of William's students, Terry Eagleton, he says of this particular derivation that, I quote, "Just as the idea of culture itself in the modern age comes to substitute itself for a fading sense of divinity and transcendence," unquote, so its partial retention of cultus links it to the reverential. He goes on to say that, quote, "Cultural truths, whether high art or the traditions of a people, are sometimes sacred ones to be protected and revered. Culture then inherits the mantle of religious authority, but also has uneasy affinities with occupation and invasion," unquote. Putting aside this last suggestion for just a moment, I'm reminded of the example a student once provided about the celebration of Dia de los Muertos in Latinx culture as perhaps having its origins in religious rituals and celebrations, and now becoming more secularized and popularized as a marker of ethnic and communal identity, not to mention the hugely popular animated film called Coco. Returning to William's history of the word culture, cultura took on the meaning of cultivation or tending to, though with subsidiary medieval meanings having to do with honor and worship. The French forms of the word cultura were couture, which has since developed its own meaning. Think of fashion with the phrase haute couture, and food with haute cuisine. Later, these combined meanings of the word culture began to enter into the English language by the early 15th century. So the word culture comes out of Roman antiquity, which is one of the reasons why it has these Eurocentric associations attached to it. Secondly, the main meaning of the word for millennia was something like husbandry or the tending of natural growth, such as crops. In its earliest uses, then, culture was a noun of process, the tending of something. The offshoot of the word is culter, meaning plowshare, a tool, which traveled by different linguistic route from culter, the Latin term for plow. In English, there are variant spellings for this, including culter, coulter, coulter, and as early as the 17th century, culture. Let's pause for a moment to consider how a word so closely associated with the opposite of nature, actually derives from the idea of doing something to, with, or for nature. As Terry Eagleton puts it, we derive our word for the finest human activities from labor and agriculture, crops and cultivation. He goes on to quote from the Renaissance-era philosopher Francis Bacon, who writes, "The culture and manurance of minds." And in that phrase, we can see the odd confluence of meanings between nature and culture. Culture, therefore, means essentially an activity, and it would be a long time before the word came to denote a thing, and an abstract thing at that. How then do we go from a word with a solid material basis to one that comes to mean something transcendent, refined, spiritual even? Well, as Williams suggests, about most of the important words we use to describe practical and material things, those words eventually take on more metaphorical meanings. This is what happened to the word culture in the early 16th century, when the tending of natural growth was extended to include a process of human development. One way to put this is to see human nature as part of nature more generally. So the behaviors, beliefs, practices that train the human mind and body are like cultivating human nature. The sense of human cultivation becomes the main sense of the word culture until the late 18th century into the early 19th century. In English literature of the time, Williams detects in the writing of Sir Thomas More things like the following: "to the culture and profit of their minds," and in Samuel Johnson things like "she neglected the culture of her understanding." Now, at various points in this linguistic development, two crucial changes occurred. One, a certain degree of habituation to the metaphorical meaning of culture turned the emphasis toward the tending of human development rather than the development of crops and animals. Secondly, the meaning shifted from particular processes to a general process, which lent the term a more abstract quality. It's from this second shift that the independent noun culture as we know it derives and begins its modern history. But the changes were so incremental and so intricate that Williams himself even declines to pinpoint exactly when this shift occurred in the use of the word culture. What we know for sure is that before the middle of the 19th century, which corresponds to roughly the publication dates of Matthew Arnold's first essays, culture as an independent noun denoting an abstract process, or the products of that process, was not very common. For instance, before this point, people generally used the word civility where we use the word culture. Something else began to happen around this time as well, when the middle classes of Europe, especially in England, began to expand their numbers and become wealthier through their commercial endeavors, their trade, and their property ownership. This large segment of the population began to acquire representation in politics and government, eventually projecting the values of industry over much of the rest of the population. By the 1700s, the English word culture took on class associations, even though at that time words like cultivation and cultivated were the more common expressions. In 1730, for example, we find a letter written by the Bishop of Killala that goes, "It has not been customary for persons of either birth or culture to breed up their children to the church." William Wordsworth, the Romantic poet, wrote in 1805, "Where grace of culture hath utterly been unknown," and he's referring to poor people at that point. And Jane Austen describes her heroine Emma in 1815 as having, quote, "every advantage of discipline and culture," unquote. So clearly the word culture was moving in the direction of our modern sense throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, but as Williams points out, other international influences came strongly into play in that development. In French, for instance, until the 18th century, the word culture was always accompanied by a grammatical form indicating the matter being cultivated, as in horticulture, agriculture, and so on, much like the earliest English usage. But around the middle of the 18th century, you begin to see in French the occasional use of culture as an independent noun, somewhat later than you do in England. At this time, the French are also using the word civilization as an independent noun that complicates the meaning of culture. In other words, this is why those words culture and civilization are sometimes used synonymously. At this point, an important development originating in Germany takes place. They borrow the word culture from the French and spell it with a K, K-U-L-T-U-R. And that word was used as a synonym for our word civilization. And I should point out here that the general difference between, in English anyway, the word civilization and the word culture is that civilization is used to denote a long period of human development in a particular place and time, and the word culture is a very different and more precise application of a smaller group and a smaller amount of time. Then we have a decisive break in the evolution of the word that comes from the work of the German historian Johann Gottfried von Herder. In his unfinished book called Ideas on the Philosophy of the History of Mankind, he writes of Kultur the following: "Nothing is more indeterminate than this word, and nothing more deceptive than its application to all nations and periods." What he means by this is that it is false to assume that civilization or human culture proceeds in a unilinear fashion, one that leads to a high point of dominance in 18th century Europe. In fact, Herder attacked what he called the European subjugation and domination of the rest of the world, writing, and I quote here, "Men of all quarters of the globe who have perished over the ages, you have not lived solely to manure the earth with your ashes, so that at the end of time your posterity should be made happy by European culture. The very thought of a superior European culture is a blatant insult to the majesty of nature," and unquote. Herder thought it was necessary to speak instead of cultures in the plural. The specific and variable cultures of different nations, peoples, and periods, but also the specific and variable cultures of social and economic groups within nations. This sense of the word has become common in anthropology, as the title of Clifford Geertz's book on our reading list makes clear, the interpretation of cultures. Herder's forward-looking idea would not fully take hold until the 20th century. Under Herder's influence, as well as that of other Romantic writers in England, France, and Germany, the idea of human development shifted away from that of civilization and progress to national and traditional cultures, which included a new category called folk culture. And this emphasis was meant to attack what was seen as the mechanical character of the new industrial civilization that was emerging, with its dependency upon abstract rationalism and its basic effect of inhumanity. It was used to distinguish between human and material development to the degree that culture now meant spiritual development and civilization meant something like the technological advancements of society. To sum up the main points of this part of the lecture concerning the linguistic development of the word culture, here are 3 definitions to remember what that word has generally meant and continues to mean. First, the independent and abstract noun which describes a general process of intellectual, spiritual, and aesthetic development which dates to the 18th century. Secondly, the independent noun, whether used generally or specifically, which indicates a particular way of life, whether of a people, a period, or a group within a larger population, which derives from the work of Herder in late 18th century Germany. And finally, the independent and abstract noun, which describes the works and practices of intellectual and especially artistic activity. This seems now the most widespread use of the term culture, and it includes things like music, literature, painting, sculpture, theater and film, and other similar forms of art.